Recently, y'all had a paper on the racial wealth gap. It's often explained as a gap between whites and blacks. That's how when we talk about racial disparities, we're talking about two different racial groups. But sometimes the way it's explained is as if the two groups are monolithic. Sometimes it's almost like you're talking about two different people. There's one person in one category, there's one person in the other category. But as we know, both these groups have tens of millions of people. In the case of whites, certainly it's a massive group of people. 200 million people, I think, in the U.S. around that. Um, and you actually found there's a lot of differences within those groups, and that maybe another way to think about this wealth gap is that it's actually a gap where a lot of people of both groups just don't have that much wealth to begin with, but there may be a bigger disparity with the top. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the one kind of easy way to do the racial wealth gap thing is to just, let's add up all the black wealth, divided by the number of black households. Usually wealth is done on a household level because, it's kind of difficult with spouses to distinguish, who owns what. And let's do the same thing for white families. How much per household? And you do that and you get about $900,000 per white family, which is very high. It's a very high amount. And then for black families, it's 140,000. And so you'll see either that statistic or you'll see a statistic where they're comparing the median white family to the median black family, and you'll see a big disparity. And what I actually kind of figured out many years ago when I was trying to kind of come up with different proposals about how to fix the racial wealth gap is that if you take those averages and you break them out in each group and you say, okay, we know on average white families have $900,000, but how much do the bottom 10% of white families have? How much do the middle 10%? How much do the top 10%? And when you do that, you basically find that the top 10% of white families owns 75% of white wealth. And then the bottom half owns like 2%. And then
Mm,
you have a sort of middle class in the middle that owns the remaining 23% or whatever.
mm,
You go into the black family and say, okay, that's very interesting. White wealth very unevenly distributed. It's mostly at the top. Now, when I first get that finding, I'm kind of like, in some ways, this is helpful for closing the racial wealth gap because you don't really have to ask too many people to pay. If there's only a
mm.
handful of white people who have the wealth, it's like, we always have the problem with middle class taxes and people don't want to pay that.
Sure.
You don't need middle class taxes because all the wealth's at the top.
Pay attention to the hustle because he just said it, but he's trying to confuse you. He's throwing a lot at you to throw you off. So, yes, the overall wealth is much lower. That's the problem. But now he's trying to say that the distribution is similar when you break it down like this. But who asked him to break it down like this? No one asked for this. Like, uh, what is this? What is he doing?
At least for this kind of project. So okay, well let's look at the black wealth distribution. You go to the black wealth distribution, the same thing. It looks identical. The top 10% of black families own 75% or more of black wealth. Bottom half 1-2%. Now the total amount of wealth is much lower, as we just discussed, but the distribution within each race is basically the same.
Mm,
And so you kind of take a step back and you say, wow, this overall disparity is really driven by the fact that the top 10% of white people are very, very wealthy. The top 10% of black people they own almost all black wealth, but they're not nearly as wealthy as the top 10% of white people. And that's driving the whole show. And I show in my piece that that's driving about 77.5%, over 3/4 of the racial wealth gap is just the difference between the wealthiest 10% of white people and the wealthiest 10% of black people. And once you figure that out, it kind of changes the story of like, what are we going to do here to fix this problem? It throws a wrench in things.
Um, no, that doesn't change anything. Like, I don't know what the fuck you think you're doing. You've given me a vague ass chart and you've thrown some numbers around, but you really haven't made a case for anything. Like, you need to get that part together.
Well, yeah, because it doesn't sound like from the numbers that you just relayed that we really are talking about just like grabbing someone from each population and then you can you're assured that one is going to be just way wealthier than the other because it's so much of it is towards the top. It seems like actually if you look at like the bottom half of each group, there's just not a whole lot of wealth there, period.
If you grab from that negative 3.3 quadrant on the black graph, which is the vast majority. And that's another thing that is very funny about this chart. It doesn't tell you how many people are actually in each group. But that bottom quadrant for black people is the vast majority of black people. You put them against anyone else in the quadrants for white people, there is a good chance that every black person in that bottom quadrant has less money than everyone else. But again, that's besides the point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so one kind of neat statistic would be, let's take the bottom 10% of white families and the bottom 10% of black families. What's the difference between them? And the answer is $15,000. And hey, 15,000. I would like to have 15,000 more dollars. Like, who wouldn't?
Mhm.
You go to the top 10% of white families and the top 10% of black families. The average difference there is $5.6 million.
Mhm.
So the gap between sort of the black and white upper class is like 350 times larger than the gap between the white and black lower class, defined as the top 10% and bottom 10%.
He still hasn't explained why we have to break it down this way, why we are comparing these groups this way. Like he's clear that we're not even talking about similar wealth even within these ranges. So what exactly is he doing? I don't see the point of this, especially when we're talking about the racial wealth gap. We are talking about a greater conversation than this. Um, in the case of black Americans who descend from American chattel slavery, we are talking about centuries of the government sabotaging our community through government laws and regulations. We're pointing to that and saying because of that, America has to deal with the wealth gap that it has created. And part of that is that the fact that we can point to things that the American government has done to benefit its white citizens exclusively. So it doesn't make sense to try to view this through a capitalistic lens or through a class lens. I mean, this has nothing to do with the point.
Do you have any information about where that wealth at the top is stored? Like, we often think about a lot of average people, which is another reason why the racial wealth gap conversation can be a little maddening at times because a lot of people just don't have like wealth. Like when I think about money, I just think about my income. Like I don't have a house, I don't have like cars, and I don't have fancy paintings or property or anything. I don't even have that much wealth to begin with. So at the very top where all this wealth is stored, where are they storing this wealth? Like what does that wealth consist of?
Yeah, it consists of mostly corporate equity of one sort or another. So you could think about Jeff Bezos. He has over $100 billion in wealth. It's almost all Amazon stock, which I think he owns something like 20 or 30% of. So he doesn't even own the whole company, but he owns like 20 to 30% of it, and that is enough to get him to that level. And some really affluent people own their own businesses, and so you'll get the equity of their own business. I guess Amazon is sort of Jeff's business, not really anymore because it's publicly traded, but that's really where it is. And I think you're right, there is a very big difference, and part of the reason why I think people can sometimes get a bit confused about this between the way, I don't know, middle class people might think about wealth and the way the people who actually own almost all the wealth think about it. And someone pointed this out on Twitter when I was kind of having a discussion about this piece. They were saying, well, the reason that there's a little bit of difficulty in comprehending this is that, a normal person, a media person who might be middle class and like talks about this thing, when they're thinking about wealth, they're thinking about basically two things. They want to buy a home, they want to have money to retire, and maybe save money for college. That's really what they're thinking about. It's just kind of getting through life. And, that's important, but that's really not, that's not where the big bucks are. It's not like Jeff Bezos has a giant 401k or 529, or, he does have a giant house, but like, that's not what it's about,
Actually, when you're talking about black wealth, that is exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about pensions and house ownership from baby boomers. That's where the vast majority of wealth in the black community is. It is in the small amount of black people who were able to get in and have those union jobs, those last little bit of union jobs, to pay them a pretty good pension. And also the few black people that held on to their homes through all of these housing crises, those are the people that have wealth in the black community, the vast majority. Now, you might point to a few entertainers and pretend that it's like there's something comparable happening, but that is not the case. There is no black version of Jeff Bezos. I don't care if you bring up Oprah. I don't care who the fuck you bring up. There is no comparison. There are white people that Oprah has to answer to in her industry. There are white people that she has to go to get financing for things that she wants to do. Because she is not the person that controls things. She is not the power broker. She's just the face.
Yeah, and so I know you've done a lot of work on like closing these gaps, or at least reducing their size, not only like between racial categorizations, but between class categorizations, or any other way you can think of people, just the closing gaps between people who are on the bottom and people who are on the top. What are some ideas you think that could be helpful in that regard? And maybe what's your critique of maybe some of the other ideas you've seen out there that maybe wouldn't be as helpful given the information that you've discovered and seen?
So, when it comes to the racial wealth gap, over the years, I've kind of thought about 4 different possibilities. The first one, and people talk a lot about this, though I don't think they think too hard about it, is let's just get the median black family up to the median white family, right? And that is actually not difficult to do because, like we said, there's very little wealth in the bottom and in the middle of society, right? The bottom half owns like 1 or 2% of the wealth. And of course, the black population is only 13% of the population. So if you want to kind of top them off and get them to the median, I calculated it's about 0.5% of national wealth. Like you could pretty much do that by just getting some money from white billionaires together, and you could make it happen. Mm-hmm. But as you might expect, something that cheap doesn't really solve the big problem. In fact, it only solves about 3% of the problem if you're talking about the overall racial wealth gap. Mm-hmm. So that seems like a dead end. Like a solution where 97% of the racial wealth gap remains is no solution at all, it would seem to me. So then you move into the second category and you say, okay, we're not going to close the median, we're going to close the mean, the average, right? The difference between 900,000 for white families and 140 for black families. And how are we going to do that? And you kind of break off into 2 ideas. You say, well, let's just make the black distribution match the white distribution, right? So, the wealthiest black person will have as much as the wealthiest white person. The poorest black person will have as much as the poorest white person.
What the fuck is he talking about? He is the only person proposing this idea. And the only reason he is proposing this idea is because he wants to use reparations to kind of force some type of wedge between rich black people and poor black people to jumpstart some socialist bullshit that has nothing to do with fucking reparations. Like, I don't even get where this is fucking coming from. Like, if we're talking about the original concept, it was at the end of the Civil War, and then you were going to give every slave 40 acres and a mule. That was the breakdown. There was no, we're going to put this in a capitalist algorithm and give the richest slave as much as the richest white person and the poorest slave. No, that's not what the fuck it was about. And that's not what the fuck it's about now.
White person. So it'll be very unequal, but it'll be equal between the races. They'll look the same. The lines will overlap, right?
Yeah.
But when you kind of go down that path, you say, well, if we did that, then that would mean that we would give, again, 350 times more money to the wealthiest black families than the poorest black families, which also seems absurd, right? So then you go into a third possibility and you say, well, okay, why don't we just give out an equal amount to each black family and we'll close the mean that way. And I've done the math on that. It's a little over 600,000. That's how much you'd have to give to each family to bring the 900,000 for whites and 140 to blacks to bring them together. But when you do that and you give every black family, whatever it is, $620,000 or something like that, what ends up happening is the poorest black family, literally the poorest black family in the country, is wealthier than 68% of white families.
And why is that a problem? I mean, if we're talking about people who have largely been excluded from the free market for the vast majority of the country's history, we're talking about a federal government who has undermined them through exclusion in the Homestead Act, exclusion from FHA subsidies that basically created the suburbs, and the FHA wanted to make the suburbs exclusively white. And I got a video on that. But anyways, we've been excluded in that way. We've been excluded, we've been excluded through the GI Bill. We've been excluded. I mean, just look at redlining. Look at the whole fucking concept. And you damn fucking right. We're supposed to be like no black person should be in poverty after reparations is done. Like that's the whole fucking point.
So there are no black families in the bottom 2/3 of society. And curiously, there also would be very few black families at the very top of society, because 600,000 is not going to get you up into the 1% or anything like that.
And see, this is what the dumbass doesn't really understand. That's not the fucking point. We're not trying to get it to where certain people are in the 1% or everybody's in the 1%. That's not what we're doing this for. What we're trying to do is get black people to some form of American normalcy. And it's mainly based on the fact that we have been left out of American normalcy.
And by the way, as a side note, the Latino wealth is very similar to black wealth, right? Like
it's almost identical.
So this would also leave that group just completely out to dry.
What do they have to do with black people? I don't understand this. I don't understand how that even comes into the discussion. They aren't black people. We aren't the same. We aren't interchangeable. We don't have the same experience in America. We didn't have the same history in America. None of this is the same. So why is that even brought up?
Yeah, they would still be just like the black wealth distribution, just still hanging out, as they are now. Some people say, well, okay, maybe we should address that separately or whatever. But yeah, they wouldn't be helped by that.
Yes, worry about that issue separately. The same way when you're dealing with their issues, you decide to handle black people separately, do that. I see no reason why we need to switch up now, especially since completely different things happen to the two groups.
But anyway, so you're like, well, that's kind of silly as well. It would seem a little bit weird to imagine that, but for histories of racism and slavery and Jim Crow and so on, every black family would be in like the upper middle class. There would be none at the top and none at the bottom. That doesn't really make sense either.
That's because that's not the fucking case. No one is making that fucking argument. What people are saying is that because of the history of slavery and segregation, that's why you need to make all these black people who come from American bondage whole.
So that's number 3. So then you go, okay, well, the median doesn't really work. Matching the distributions, that seems goofy. You're just giving a bunch of money to affluent black families. Flat payment, weird. All, just every black family's in the upper middle class. Like,
I see nothing weird about it. You have not explained why it's weird. In fact, that is the correct thing to do.
and then you're left with, well, we need to do general redistribution.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the point where the mask is off and you can completely see the snake that this person actually is. Again, like I was trying to explain, all of this was some convoluted bullshit to funnel us back to some socialist nonsense. They just don't have the balls to be honest about what the fuck they're doing. These are not allies, these are your fucking enemies. Look at the face. Remember it. Remember his fucking name. Any fucking time they try to come at you with some bullshit about how they're trying to fix inequality, remember what the fuck they mean. They don't mean fixing shit for you. They don't mean justice for you. It's fuck you. They are trying to take your shit and twist it.
The top 10% of the country in terms of wealth is almost all white, like 90+% white. The bottom half is about 50-50, black,
right,
Latino, and white, or I guess I should say non-white and white, right? 50-50. So move money from the top to the bottom, you solve both problems at the same time, because the racial gap shrinks and the class gap shrinks, and you don't run into those other problems. It just sort of solves both problems simultaneously, brings everyone up together. You would think less resentment from Latinos and poor whites who are kind of like, well,
right.
hey,
This is bullshit. If you're going to move poor whites up alongside poor blacks, you're not closing the racial wealth gap. You're only deepening it. He knows that. But it's not about closing the racial wealth gap. It's about this working class wealth redistribution, and black people are not in the equation in his mind. Our situation is not really the concern. And you see what he did about this whole fucking resentment game. So everybody else can get justice in this fucking country, and we're not concerned about resentment because we're more concerned about fucking justice. But when black people are in a position to receive fucking justice, that's when all these motherfuckers come out the bag with what they really fucking feel. And this is what they really mean. They mean their own resentment. These motherfuckers aren't your friends. They're your enemies.
And is there anything else you'd like to add just about kind of how you think we should rethink the way that we think about this gap?
I think one thing we should think about a little bit more on this, and this is more on the kind of conceptual, philosophical level, is I think that people are maybe not as thoughtful on, who did Jim Crow and slavery, like who kind of got cut down the most on that.
This is like some super villain shit that he's doing right now. Like, it's some real diabolical shit. Because he took the Reparations project and he deconstructed it. And he really set it up to manipulate people to be anti-capitalist. And look, I get that's what your agenda is, but come on, man. Like, do black people really need this shit? How could you sit here and act like how could you sit here and act like you are an ally? And you really are trying to derail reparations by, with a straight, Trojan horse tactic of causing friction between black folks rich and poor over who was harmed by slavery and segregation more. And you're not even like on some real scientific shit where you went back and you traced everybody's history and you can say for some fact that you know who was damaged in which economic way. No, you're really just playing with numbers and using it, like you're weaponizing it to just fuck with us.
Because I think when you present the fact that, hey, the difference is mostly between the top 10%, I think people recoil from that a little bit. They think that there's something goofy and weird going on. But, I think it's worth pointing out that, in a capitalist system in general, right, the bottom half, the middle class, they get their money comes in the door, money comes out the door. They don't accumulate very much.
No one is recoiling from the fact that you're comparing poor white people to poor black people right now, today. Like, obviously, if you compare poor white people to poor black people, they're going to have poverty in common. So, the problem here is that you want to talk about the situation without putting it in any historical context. So yes, maybe today white people in poverty cannot build wealth, just like black people in poverty can't build wealth, just like all people in poverty can't build wealth. But we're talking about black people, or people who have been here since the beginning of the country and have been sabotaged during the whole existence of this country. So, like, the government created this wealth gap. Like, it has perpetuated a situation where its white citizens were able to build wealth and its black citizens were stuck in a situation of poverty.
It's really only the top that's capable of accumulating a lot. Right. And so it shouldn't be surprising that that's where you find the difference. Right. It shouldn't be surprising that when they expropriated all those black farmers back in the day, that's going to show up in the top 10%, because people who own their own land, that's they're relatively well off to own your own land. Like, most black people and most white people didn't own their own land.
He's saying that it should be no surprise to anyone that this is how it ends up, based on a capitalistic algorithm that he has created in his own mind. And what he's doing is he's taking the outcomes that have come about because of the racism that black people have experienced, and saying that he has been able to calculate what would have happened if racism never happened, but he's basing that on the outcomes of a society with racism, which makes absolutely no fucking sense. He's not going back into your lineage, looking at every disadvantage that your family has experienced, and then coming up with a calculation that would show what exactly you should have earned based on the harm that was done to your family. Even though that's kind of like the argument he's trying to claim that he's making here. All he is doing is using these outcomes. Well, where is he starting from? If racism never happened in America, would black people have ever come here as slaves? And if they did, then are we starting from the point of freedom for the slaves? Or are we starting from like the point of the beginning of the country? Like, where are we starting from? Because if we're starting from 1865, when they freed the slaves, which would make the most sense, then we would be talking about each black person getting 40 acres and a mule. That way, like, all the poor black people who were formerly slaves, they would all have land, which is a complete contradiction of the bullshit he just tried to tell us. And another contradiction of the bullshit that he's trying to tell us is this idea that poor people didn't own land at some mysterious time period that he has not been very clear about. Because if we look at the Homestead Act, if we look at FHA subsidies, like the GI Bill, like all that good shit that has happened with housing in this country, that's a complete lie. So, like, we got to be real about what's happening here.
Or even things like redlining. If you're in the bottom class, lower classes of Black people, you were not ever getting a home. You were going to rent all the time. So redlining really hurt middle class and especially upper class Black families who were unable to buy in better areas and got worse, And so
I thought he just said that he was doing a model of what would have happened to Black people just through capitalism without any racism involved. If that was the case, then redlining wouldn't have happened. See, this is the problem. Like, he doesn't know how he's even trying. He doesn't even know what he's trying to argue. Like, this is it's just complete bullshit. And if he knows about redlining, then he knows he was just lying to you about poor white people's ability to build wealth versus poor Black people's ability to build wealth. He knows better than the shit he was just trying to tell you.
It shouldn't be shocking that this is how it plays out, and it just kind of adds a little more texture to the story, as opposed to, I think for some people they view it as, oh, you're just trying to say, there was no racism or oppression and so on. It's like, no, that's not true at all. It's just we need to think harder about where that would have materialized, and for the most part, it's keeping down the Black upper class, people who would have owned things, people who would have had businesses, because that's where the wealth would have accumulated. And that's where they stopped the wealth from accumulating. The bottom would have never accumulated wealth. The bottom 30% of white families have an average of $980.
Well, you clearly don't understand the history of racism in this country. You don't understand redlining. Like, this is a real shitty analysis, and I don't understand how the fuck you get a paycheck for doing this bullshit.